Paola, welcome to the Lives of the Artists. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Nick, thank you so much for having me. It is a true pleasure.
Thank you so much. So, Paola, you are a preeminent art historian focused mainly on Renaissance art. But if you could introduce yourself to the audience a little bit and tell us a little bit about your background, that would be wonderful.
All right. So I'm a Renaissance art historian. I got my graduate degree at Syracuse University in Florence. And really, my specialty is Quattrocento Florence. So everything that has to do with the 15th century, which, of course, as you know, Nick, is the most exciting time in Florentine history, as all of the great artists were living in Florence at the time, sharing ideas, competing in many important public and private competitions as well. And it's really been a true pleasure for me to be researching and living kind of the Renaissance life in Florence for the last 20 years.
Oh, amazing. I mean, what an incredible life. And yeah, I completely agree. I've been so excited to talk to you about the Renaissance. You know, in people's heads, the Renaissance is kind of this explosion of creativity, architecture, art, painting, sculpture. You know, the city of Florence just came alive. But how did that happen? What was going on? What were the reasons for it? You know, I'd love to kind of dig down into that and try and understand a little bit more about, you know, what was going on at that time.
Yes, I think it's a question I get so often, how come it all starts in Florence? What is happening? What is in the water? What are these people drinking? And I think what is interesting is just the kind of the setting, basically in the society itself was already there. We have many merchant families, very successful Florentine families, who, as they are building their name in the business itself, the world of business, they actually also try to partner up with different artists, and they start commissioning the works of art. Because I think for the average Florentine, if you were a successful Florentine living in the, let's say, 15th century, your life was really revolving around your city. And every contract, I read by any Florentine commissioning an artist to do something very small or something very big, they always say, make it in the glory of God, in the glory of my city, and in the glory of my name. So this idea of giving back to the community becomes extremely important to them. And, one family that I think is really epitome of all of that is going to be the Medici family.
Of course, yeah. That was the family that came to incredible power within the city of Florence. So is that the best place to start?
I mean, with the Medici family, we have something very tangible to hold on to, but there's so many other families that, maybe most people never really heard of, but they were as important, as prestigious as Medici's were. For example, the Strozzi family, their big competition. But it is the Medici that will basically be the de facto rulers of the city. And they will be the ones who will have this very close relationship. For example, Cosimo the Elder, who is going to kind of start the really big, important Medici bank. He's basically working with his father, but Cosimo the Elder will be the one who will be the first de facto ruler of the city. And he gets to be such a close friend with Donatello that when Donatello died, he was actually buried next to Cosimo in the tomb in San Lorenzo Church.
Wow. So they had a very close relationship with these artists.
Yes.
But let's back up a little bit. So the Medici family are really the most tangible family to talk about. They came to the most power in Florence, but there were other families, powerful families, of course, vying for power. But the Medici seemed to be the family that really broke through. And they started, from what I understand, as wool merchants. Is that right?
Actually, they're money changers. They're really.
But that was later. So then they got into banking. But initially, were they trading in wool?
I think all of the Venetian families are trading wool. This is kind of the most important trade in the city, because if you think about the historical documents, about 80% of the Florentine population are involved in the wool industry.
Right.
And those that are the poorest of the poor are going to be the ones who will be, washing the wool, shredding it, dyeing it, using the Arno River for that. And then those that are a little bit
Because there was
higher
no
up.
cotton, there was nothing else. People just wore wool.
Yes. Well, we will see Leonardo wears linen, and we will
Oh,
go into
wow.
that later on.
So then they got into banking,
Yes.
and then from this, their power grew and grew and grew. Why exactly? Surely there was other families that were into banking too. Why were they such successful bankers?
There definitely other people who are quite successful as well as them. Let's go, if you go back a century before, we go into in 1300s. Medici's are still, they're not in the picture yet. We have families like Bardi and Peruzzi. We also have Frescobaldi. All these families are, typical Florentine families. And Bardi and Peruzzi are kind of special because they are sponsoring the war of the King of England. And he never paid his debt. So that forced both of the families to go into bankruptcy in 1320s.
Thanks to the King of England.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I did
But
not
just
know
to
that.
tell you, these are like these two very small local families living around Santa Croce neighborhood. And here they are so powerful. They're actually, sending their funding for the wars in England. So before they lost everything, they actually commissioned Giotto to paint chapels for them in Santa Croce Church. So luckily we get to see their art patronage still today.
So there was a kind of culture of this happening within the city and maybe within Italy as well in a greater context of this sort of art patronage, money. I mean, as we see today, money, people with money buy art. But back then, they were sort of buying art and in a religious sense. Is that right? They were sort of buying religious art or paying for religious art, paying for religious public art. It wasn't for their houses so much, was it? Or how did it all work?
Both. I mean, it all kind of starts with paying for the local churches, or basically purchasing a private family chapel. And once you got this prime real estate, so basically every Florentine church would be built according or thanks to those donations. Let's say, use the example of Santa Croce, where I used to work for many years. We have one of the first contracts of a private individual who is buying a private family chapel, actually is in Santa Croce Church. And it's a Bardi family. So, or actually, no, it's a Peruzzi who buys the first ever chapel. And then once you buy the chapel, what you get in return will be an empty space. And it is you as a owner who now has a responsibility to actually pay an artist to come in, put the frescoes in, put an iron gate. Some of them still have their iron gates, and there's still keys, original keys from 1320s to actually open them. And then you would also pay for an altarpiece, for the masses to be said, for the candles to be burned. So it's like a huge investment. And we're talking about millions of dollars, in today's terms.
But there are what a lot of these little private family chapels within the city. That's why when you go to Italy now, there's a church on every corner. This must have been a sort of tradition of all these families that came into wealth buying these private family chapels and decorating them. So there was this sort of culture within Italy of doing that. And obviously the Medicis, being a big prominent family, would buy a bigger chapel, a bigger church.
Yes, so they would be, as well, all the other people, they're kind of competing, for the best location, because of course you want to have your chapel to be very close to the high altar, so location also counts. Right. So if you are a prominent Florentine family and you walk into the church, you kind of know who is where, because on the top of each of the arches where the two parts meet, there would be a family crest. That would be a very lovely way to advertise, who owns what. You can even go bigger than that. For example, Church of Santa Maria Novella, close to the train station. If you stop and look, this is Alberti's only Renaissance facade in the city. And there's the name of the patron, Rucellai, Paolo, basically Giovanni, son of Paolo Rucellai, who pays for for the entire facade with the request to then have his name spelled out. So, we kind of think about the idea of patronage and advertising what you own as something very modern, but actually it all started in Florence in the 15th century.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, yeah, you do think of patronage within the art world. People that have money tend to invest in art, but I think back then it was much more tied up in power. Maybe they sort of bought these public works of art because they wanted to show their power. They were the Medici that were putting these things in place, and it sort of brought them kudos. Money was one thing. They obviously had enough money from, they had a lot of money from banking, but then what's the next step? It's public power, isn't it? How do you gain public power in Renaissance? You buy public art for the city to enjoy.
And there's also a wonderful quote by Cosimo the Elder in which he says that Florentines will tend to forget. They tend to forget big families, but he says the works of art and the works of architecture are the ones that kind of root you and give you a place in the city, a tangible place in the city. But then he also says that he had a lot of fun amassing his wealth, but even more fun actually spending it all. So for his generosity and for this kind of sense of giving back to the community, Cosimo was named Pater Patriae, the father of the fatherland. So he was the father of all the Florentines in the city. So he's a very careful man to kind of walk that line of power.
What kind of wealth are we talking about? I mean, are we talking sort of on par with Elon Musk, or are we talking more? Are we talking less? Try and give a little bit of context. How much money did the Medicis have to own a city, to basically rule a city? No one does that now. If you're a tech billionaire, you don't go and buy a city, but back then it seemed to be the way it was. What kind of wealth are we thinking?
Well, you know what? I think it's hard to put a dollar or euro value to what they had because the land, there was kind of different currency depending on what you were buying. So food or land or, property. But Medici's, they don't own the entire city. They have their own palace, and there are other palazzi as bigger and as beautiful as their own, even bigger actually. But they are the ones who are in Palazzo Vecchio. So they have the power is in their own hands. And the money we're talking about.
Yes, sorry, go on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
On this one, Nick, I do have some, sources I could look into actually, because the Rucellai family, for example, are the ones who are, also very important wool merchants. Giovanni Rucellai is the one who pays Leo Battista Alberti to do not only the facade of the church, but also his own private family palace. And at one point, there's a letter of Giovanni's son, who is in Jerusalem. They are traveling to see the sepulchre of Christ. And they have money basically on 3 different ships. And one of them was stopped by the pirates. Nick, if you give me a moment, I can even find for you, how much money was lost. And there's just one ship. And he kind of goes into very, he writes to his mother to tell her what happened. And he said, Mom, God gives and God takes away. But you're talking about millions of dollars today. So, just that cash basically traveling around the Mediterranean, on different ships and things like that.
And was it bullion? Was it gold bullion, or did they actually carry around sort of gold coins? Or what?
I think it was gold coins. Was gold coins. But Nick, I will have to, I have to give you precise information on this because it's actually quite fascinating.
No, it is fascinating. So the Medici go from being bankers to rulers of the city. I know they didn't own physical property. That they didn't own the physical property of the city, but they went to be rulers of Florence. What was that transition, and where in that did the art come? I mean, was it before, after? Where did that sort of? Can you explain that transition a little bit?
I love to think about Cosimo the Elder, who is kind of who starts it all. He's the one who has the brains, and he really is very careful not to appear to be a ruler of the city, because Florence is a republic. They translate works of Plato and Aristotle. They kind of live with these ideals of republican government. So in Florence, anyone who is over 30 years of age and a member of a guild could basically qualify to hold a political office. It will be a very quick term, in and out, because they don't want anyone to take over the power or use that in their own personal interest if they stay too long in the office. But in case of Cosimo, he's basically able to kind of choose his men. He always approves of who is chosen and who is in Palazzo Vecchio. And then it will be his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who will kind of continue with that same diplomatic ability that his grandfather had. But it will be under Lorenzo that we get to see artists like young Michelangelo. Lorenzo sees him, according to the legend, he sees him working in this garden of San Marco, and he invites
it wasn't so you're saying Cosimo the Elder was the one that sort of made the real power and money in the bank, but he wasn't really the big patron. It was his grandson.
Yes, so Cosimo is a patron in his own in his own right. He works very closely with Donatello. He is definitely commissioning works of art. He's also building the family palace as well. And curiously, he doesn't give the palace project to Brunelleschi, the most important artist in town, the most important architect, because he doesn't want to appear that he's too much. He's trying to fit in to the point where, as old men in Florence are going around the mule, on a mule, he's also on a mule. He doesn't even want to appear that he has a horse or a carriage, which of course he had. So he's walking that really incredible line of just appearing first among equals.
Wow, that's you don't really see that in the wealthy today. They definitely flash their wealth, but you see that in someone like the Pope. He has immense power and access to immense wealth, but he cannot show it. As we saw with Pope Francis that passed away, he lived, in a very simple room, and he used to wash the poor, and immigrants' feet and things like that to sort of show his piety and that he's not, using wealth or anything like that to his advantage. So that was more the style back then with Cosimo. But was that the style with his grandson? You're saying that his grandson was like that too?
I think Lorenzo will take it even to another level, in where he will have a beautiful court of people around him, and they're all humanists. And what is lovely about it is that you don't see a competition or backstabbing around Lorenzo. It seems like it really speaks about him as a ruler, that everyone kind of had their place around him. And because Lorenzo himself spoke Greek and Latin, he was actually able to write poetry as well. So the people around him are really just this flowering or flourishing of arts and of all kind. Will basically happen with Lorenzo's rule. So 1470s, 80s, Lorenzo dies in 1492. And this will be kind of the beginning of a very different way of living in Florence. I love that, when Columbus is sailing the ocean blue, the situation will completely change in Florence. And there will never be someone as capable, in a way, as Lorenzo was. Some historians say that Lorenzo actually kept the entire balance of the city-states and countries in Europe in his own hands, that he was the one kind of directing it all. So artists like Michelangelo will be under his wing. Someone like Botticelli will be working very closely in that circle. So if you go to the Uffizi Gallery, kind of, the best rooms with the most beautiful Renaissance art are kind of going to be connected to Lorenzo in a way.
So yeah, we could see this this period of time with Cosimo the Elder's grandson. So we're talking two generations. Lorenzo had obviously, had been living in this very wealthy family, had been, wealthy for a couple of generations now. And Lorenzo really is the golden age of this sort of flourishing in Florence. And he really takes these incredible artists under his wing. And today we're going to focus on, I mean, are we going to focus on Leonardo da Vinci, or where would you like to go with it?
Yes, yes, I would love to talk about Leonardo, especially because there is a beautiful show happening right now in Venice. Galleria di Accademia is actually showing one of the most precious works of art that they have in their collection, which is the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo, which kind of inspired me to dig very deep to understand why the drawing was so important. And also on the way, I kind of discovered a lot more about Leonardo. Of course, we know him as an artist. Everyone knows his works like Mona Lisa. But actually, there is so much more to him because Leonardo will leave behind 7,200 pages of drawings and texts accompanying them in his very typical mirror writing fashion, right? He's writing backwards.
So he's writing backwards from the start?
From the start. I mean, Leonardo is special in so many ways, but he was left-handed. He didn't learn Latin in school. He was an illegitimate son of a man who was a notary. Ser Piero da Vinci belongs to a very long line of notaries, like his grandfather was a notary. So Leonardo because he was born out of wedlock, he had a very different childhood. And because he's kind of free to spend time in nature and go with his imagination, to places, will give us Leonardo that we know today. If he was born in a regular marriage, he probably would be trained to become a notary. He would have been a horrible notary, Nick, because this guy didn't respect a single deadline. And notaries in Italy is like, a lawyer kind of. So you really have to be very precise. You're drawing documents. And we will see Leonardo doing something different.
Notaries would have written up legal documents basically back then. A pretty boring job, but a well-paid, pretty steady living. And you're saying that Leonardo was born out of wedlock, and because of this, he wasn't made to be a notary. He was sort of allowed to be more of an individual. That's a very interesting observation. I never really looked at it like that. But was he loved by his father, or was he shunned, or was he? What was the situation with him growing up? Did he grow up with his mother, with his father?
He grows up with his father. His mother ended up marrying someone else. It is kind of incredible that it was Leonardo's father, who marries 4 times, by the way, in his long life. He was the one who actually made arrangements for Caterina, this young woman who had a child with him, to marry someone else. So Leonardo's life will be, right from the start, very, very different.
And he didn't spend much time with his mother.
He didn't.
No. And so what was the relationship with Leonardo's father and Caterina, his mother? Like, how did they meet, kind of thing?
I think I would have to, look a little bit more into Caterina, but I know that she comes from a very simple, very poor family, and they probably would have met around Vinci, which is a small town, about 40 kilometers from Florence. And I think, at the time, it would be very typical for men to have children out of wedlock, usually with women who are working for them, like, servants. And the only thing the father had to do was actually accept the child, meaning giving them their last name. Right. And we get to see that very often in Florence. So in that respect, Leonardo was not something unusual or, special. But I think what that gave him was kind of a little bit more of a freedom to do what he wanted, because there was not a burden, for him to be the only son of Da Vinci, who has to continue the family line, who has to, be a notary, to kind of keep going in what generations of them would have done in the past. I know that his father is useful to Leonardo in a way that he actually is able to negotiate his first contracts. For example, one of the earliest portraits Leonardo does is a portrait of Ginevra de' Benci. And we know that Leonardo's father is actually a notary for the Vinci family. So he also works very closely with Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, and we will see that Leonardo will actually be getting to do his anatomical studies in that hospital later on. So I think the father is opening doors for him.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So, yeah, I mean, when you think of Leonardo da Vinci, you think of one of the greatest geniuses that's ever, walked planet Earth. He's sort of a symbol for genius, isn't he? The Mona Lisa is the most viewed painting in the world. His notebooks, his ideas are just seen as, this sort of, individual genius that came from nowhere. But that genius must have come from somewhere. But in Vinci, where he grew up, you're saying it was a pretty normal upbringing. There was nothing special about it. I mean, he didn't have access to power or anything like that. There was just a normal upbringing.
You know what? Yes, normal, but I think also in a way abnormal, because he doesn't really go to school. He doesn't have a traditional schooling for someone who will be a ruling class in Florence. So, for example, he doesn't really learn Latin, which is actually truly a blessing, because as we will see, as we go through some of these slides I prepared, Leonardo will have a very hard time reconciling what he discovers on his own, like his own scientific experiments. And then when he starts reading other people's work and he teaches himself Latin, we kind of see, oh, wow, am I wrong? Am I not? But I love the fact that Leonardo always uses his own scientific measurements, for example. We will talk about that when we go to see the Vitruvian man, and how he's looking at Vitruvius' text, but he's actually also really just giving us his own findings at the time.
And so how old was he when he went to Florence? I mean, obviously he's born in Vinci, which is 40 minutes or 40 miles, you said, from Florence. Obviously, at some point, if you're a talented boy, you want to be going to Florence. It's like one of the centers of Europe. How old was he when he arrived in Florence, and what was the initial life for him?
I think for sure he's brought into town as I'm actually not sure about this. I would have to look in his early life, but I think he very quickly moves to the city, and they have a palace, the Palazzo Gondi today, actually just behind Palazzo Vecchio. This is where Leonardo would have been brought up. And he entered.
Who did he go to live with? Was he
with his father?
Oh, so his father went to Florence, and he went with his father.
Yes, exactly. So the father has a palace in Florence, and then Leonardo will enter the studio of Verrocchio, who will be his teacher. And we will actually talk about Verrocchio. I will also show you kind of why we believe that maybe Leonardo was a model for some of Verrocchio's really important works as well.
Okay, great.
But if you want, I can share the screen.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
And let's see. All right. Do you see it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right. So my goal would be...
There we go. That's great. So yeah, let's go through this.
Nick, my goal would be to really, show Leonardo who he was, through his own words, but also image, but also people who were close to him. So I wanted to start with this portrait of Leonardo, and this should be considered as the only real portrait of Leonardo that was done by Francesco Melzi, who was actually his longtime assistant and a man who will accompany Leonardo also in France.
How old do we think Leonardo is here?
It might be, he might be in his late, maybe 50s when this was done.
Right.
And we believe that actually Francesco Melzi is working on this, but maybe Leonardo is adding these little kind of very lively touches in the hair to kind of enliven the image. And we will talk about this a little bit later on. But my goal today will be to kind of talk about Leonardo and how he trains as an artist in Florence, but when he moved to Milan in 1480s, his interest in scientific matters will blossom. And we will see that he divides even more time. Once he becomes kind of famous, he just dedicates even more time to his research, in particular the study of anatomy, with the ultimate aim to actually publish a kind of a treatise on this, which he never doesn't get to do. But we will get to see how Leonardo was actually a genius, not only with a pen, but also with a surgical knife. And I will also attempt to show how Leonardo was actually influenced by the scholars and people around him, because unlike, Michelangelo, who didn't really love too many people around him, he was like a loner and someone who would work alone and really kind of a lonely genius. Leonardo had people around him all the time, courtiers, friends, servants. He's kind of the life of the party. And in his notebooks, we find tons of notes on the margins of his pages where he actually talks about, who he has to check in with or ask a question from. So we get to see that Leonardo's friendships were mostly intellectual friendships. And what is for me incredible is that, in these 7,000 pages, we don't have many personal, sorry. Sorry about that.
All right. Keep going.
We don't, what is fascinating to me is that Leonardo's friendships are always intellectual ones, and that we don't get to have a lot of personal information about him, even though he leaves us this incredible amount of pages and this incredible patrimony. We don't really have a peek in his soul, which is really interesting.
Right.
But anyway, what I do have here is a few people who write about him.
He was a man of outstanding beauty and infinite grace, striking and handsome, and his great presence brought comfort to the most troubled soul. His disposition was so lovable that he commanded everyone's affection. He was clearly a very jovial, lovable guy. I mean, it sounds like he was very social, very well liked by his patrons and for the people around him. He had a lot of friends. I didn't know that about him.
And then, it goes on. Paolo Giovio, who is also someone who was in his circle.
He was friendly, precise, and generous, with a radiant, graceful expression. His genius for invention was astounding, and he was the arbiter of all questions relating to beauty and elegance. Wow.
It goes on. We have a really interesting picture of Leonardo that kind of comes through the pages. This is someone who writes a little bit later on in the 16th century. Anonimo Magliabecchiano. It's a document actually kept in Florence.
Let me read it. He was a beautiful person, well proportioned, agreeable, and lovely to look at. He wore a short rose-coloured tunic reaching down to his knees. At the time when long clothes were being worn, a fine beard, well arranged in ringlets, descended to the middle of his chest. Sounds like that guy fancied him.
Sounds like, Leonardo is kind of like a bit of a fashion designer, designing his own clothes. I mean, really,
doesn't it? Yeah. It sounds like he's quite a dandy and a man about town. I mean, people must have known him in the street by the sounds of it. He would have been maybe stood out a little bit socially in the street, do you think?
Yes, he totally stood out. And I think actually, the things I prepared as well, are really fascinating. As you can see, what Vasari writes about him.
He was so generous that he sheltered and fed all his friends, rich or poor. He possessed nothing and worked little, but he always kept servants and horses. How was he able to do that if he didn't work very much and possessed nothing?
That's a good question. And I think, just kind of speaks about him always making ends meet. My dear professor, Rob Hatfield at Syracuse, is an expert on Michelangelo and Leonardo. And Rob actually wrote this book called The Wealth of Michelangelo, in which he speaks about Michelangelo and how savvy he is. He always has money in the bank. He's always investing, always buying property, And then he kind of goes to do the same thing for Leonardo to kind of see if he can, trace his bank accounts. And, with Leonardo, it's like if he makes 100 ducats and he deposits that in the bank on a Monday, by Friday, he will go to take 50 out of there. So we kind of see Leonardo as this dreamer. And that is also why he desperately needed to have a patron,
Right.
who will provide not only room and board, but everything else for him, which will eventually take him to the court of the King of France, Francois I.
I know who I'd like to be friends with rather than, I definitely prefer to be friends with Leonardo. He sounds like much more fun.
Yes, you're on the Leonardo team. But
Yeah.
look at this one. I love this Florentine traveler to India.
People here do not feed on anything that has blood, nor will they allow anyone to hurt any living thing like our Leonardo da Vinci. This is a Florentine traveler to India.
So you see kind of how even like obviously he's so well known that Florentines talk about him, and the fact that he was actually a vegetarian will
Right.
be something that will be very important for Leonardo. So he was such a trailblazer in so many ways. I think I also have another one actually that what Leonardo himself says.
Men who desire nothing but material riches are are absolutely devoid of the desire for wisdom, which is the sustenance and truly dependable wealth of the mind. Wow, that's incredible. Who is this, a portrait of Leonardo
It
here?
is not. It is
No.
not. I wanted to share this one for that purpose because somehow this is engraved in everyone's mind as a portrait of an old man, of Leonardo. But if this was done in 1490, Leonardo would have been only in his 40s. This is way too old to be, his own portrait. And somehow this same portrait also became like portrait of Aristotle. We get to see this in the School of Athens.
Okay.
Um, so anyway, this is not Leonardo, but the one I showed by Melzi is what we kind of should consider as Leonardo's likeness. And to kind of start with, the drapery studies, I wanted to, and Nick, I'm sure you have done this when you started your training in school. Did you have to do the drapery studies?
No, but they should have, to be honest. It's much more difficult than you think to paint drapery. Yeah, it wasn't really much of a focus on that, but I'm glad to see that Leonardo was focusing on it. I mean, so here we have Andrea del Verrocchio, and he was training Leonardo da Vinci. Is that right?
Yes, so Verrocchio had a very busy studio. It was one of the busiest places in Florence. He had many artists around him. And, I think there's a lovely quote by Leonardo who says all the artists who had good stuff were all drinking from Verrocchio's well. Like,
Wow.
they all had to come to his fountain and, learn or copy what Verrocchio does. And I wanted to show you this here because this is typical, and kind of a typical process for an art student would be to do this. And, we even have Vasari speaks about this.
He would make clay models of figures draping them with soft rags dipped in plaster, and would then draw them on cloth in black and white with the point of the brush in a way that seemed a miraculous thing.
You kind of see how beautiful, Leonardo's, drawing is. But I wanted to contrast that with probably what we consider the first ever landscape drawing in, at least in a Florentine collection. And this is young Leonardo actually looking at the Arno and looking at the valley in front of him, just kind of recording what he sees. And this will be something very unusual at the time because, this will be kind of what students will be encouraged to do. And Nick, as an artist, you kind of see how lively the line is.
Yeah,
The flow
yeah,
of
beautiful.
energy is absolutely beautiful.
So this is early on in his sketchbooks, is it?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And you really kind of see, how Leonardo is looking how the light affects the vision of rocks and the trees and waters and fields. We can have this beautiful continuous flow of energy. And just to also, look at in the background, you can really see nicely that he knows his perspective. He signs the work actually he dates it in the upper left. It's a holiday in August, Santa Maria della Neve. So we even have a date to this. It's actually in the Uffizi drawing collection. We also have this. Oh, here is a lovely quote by Leonardo himself.
Okay, great. I can't actually read it because it's
Okay,
behind.
I can.
Okay.
It just kind of speaks about how much he loved nature. And he says, although human ingenuity may devise various inventions, it will never discover any inventions more beautiful, more simple, or more practical than those of nature, because in her inventions there is nothing lacking and nothing superfluous.
Fantastic.
Now compare that really kind of easy draw, kind of free-flowing drawing to his preparatory sketch in the Uffizi Gallery. And you just can imagine the hours of work he had to do with a pen and a ruler to be able to do this, put all these orthogonals, figure out kind of a perfect perspective, one point linear perspective, of course, invented in Florence in about 1418 by Brunelleschi. And you see the vanishing point in the back.
Oh wow, yes.
So you really
Incredible.
see young artist who is not taking any shortcuts. I mean, this guy is doing the work. And I love it. That's already here, even though we see all these, lovely lines. It's very geometrical. He does populate this with all of these people and horses, which were his favorite animals. We can already see his mind wandering off, and he's trying to kind of understand what will be painted in this work. And just to see, this is the painting itself. This is before it was cleaned in the Uffizi Gallery, but you see the background, and you really clearly see what Leonardo was trying to figure out.
It's just such a complex image that he's trying to, and it was unfinished.
Yes, it will stay unfinished because Leonardo will actually get a job that will take him to Milan.
Right.
And he will leave this undone, promising to the friars that he would come back. And of course, he never does. So,
So was this the last painting he did before he left Florence?
yes, he's working on this. And he's also, does his Annunciation. We'll show you that one as well. But I think it's also interesting, there is no way he could have finished this. I mean, he just puts so much in it, hundreds of figures, horses, all these incredible, structure in the back.
It's almost like that famous quote, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." It's like his imagination is almost too much to execute. Like this is a very ambitious image that he's trying to paint here.
Yes.
And it was I can imagine him thinking, oh my god, what have I got myself into? This is so complicated.
Yeah. Well, you know what I love about
he has a reputation, doesn't he, for not finishing work?
He does. I mean, I love to, some people believe that this man standing at the far right is actually Leonardo himself.
Oh, right. Yeah.
This could make sense because we have a portrait, we have another Annunciation by Botticelli actually in the Uffizi Gallery. And this is where we find Botticelli standing. So, this is a contemporary of Leonardo. It could be, but you see, he's not even looking at us. He's actually looking to the side, almost like, what's coming next. But for me, Nick, what I see in this unfinished work is Leonardo kind of putting seeds of all of the works of art that will come in his career. Maybe the Mona Lisa, the women here by the tree, or maybe the old man.
I thought he painted the Mona Lisa by this point.
No, he will he will actually come back. When he comes back from Milan to Florence.
Oh, okay.
This will be his new project. Or, like maybe these old men are all going to be in his Last Supper in Milan.
I actually think those intimate portraits that he did are his best work. I mean, there's the famous one in Poland, the lady holding the ermine. The Mona Lisa, of course, is beautiful, but those intimate portraits that he did are really fine, fine portraits, and there's an intimacy to them that's very revealing that you don't really see in this kind of painting, do you?
Yes, I think what makes this one very special is the fact that other artists who are painting the other basically the adoration of the Magi, the three kings coming to see the baby, they usually paint luxurious fabrics and just beautiful interiors. With Leonardo, it's all about human emotion and kind of asking the question, what if you were standing in a group and they were saying, this is the savior who was born, how would people react? So we see this emotional reaction, disbelief in the figures around it. It's a really unique work of art. I mean, overall, Leonardo paints less than 20 paintings in his lifetime. But people see, how many drawings he does. It's like, thousands of drawings compared to just few finished works.
Yeah, incredible that he only painted 20 paintings in his lifetime, but he's considered sort of one of the finest painters that's ever lived. But he probably didn't see himself like that. He probably saw himself more as an inventor, a scientist, a mathematician, not predominantly an artist. Would you say that's right?
For sure. And when he applies for the job with Sforza, the good Duke of Milan, he writes this famous kind of cover letter where he's applying for the job, and he tells the Duke what he can do, kind of like these bullet points. It's all about warfare, and he really sees himself as an engineer who can kind of reorganize the city of Milan. And then at the end of this like 2-page document, he actually says, and I can paint and sculpt like any other man. So
Just like
obviously, no, it's
just
like
like
a PS.
a footnote, yeah. Oh, by the way, I can also paint.
Yes, yes. So it kind of tells how he wanted to be seen. But I think I just have few pages here, Nick, of kind of just to show the variety of the interests that Leonardo had. And I think it's typical what you see is he's drawing, but at the same time he's actually explaining, what he's figuring out. But then sometimes the comments you see in the margins are completely unrelated. I mean, definitely like ADD, he goes in every possible direction as he's doing this. So there are mechanical studies. There are the studies of nature. I mean, look, beautiful, flowers. You can really see that immediacy of this work is actually quite lovely. And you see what basically what Vasari said.
Yeah, he would not kill a flea for any reason whatsoever. He preferred to dress in linen so as not to wear something dead.
So in the time when people are wearing furs left and right, Leonardo is very conscientious about his choices.
Wow,
Um,
that's really interesting.
My favorite are these studies of water. Leonardo was really obsessed with the power of water and kind of trying to to show the power of this on a page. But
Yeah, seems like he's trying to understand, the science of water, how it works, and
yes, yes, the flow. How if it kind of catches if there's a rock, it will go faster around it. But I love that these curls that we see, the beautiful curls we see in the drawing itself, are then also put on in other places. Like, for example, here you see on the left a really lovely drawing of a storm or like deluge coming in. But then
oh
you see
wow,
that same curl in the head of Leonardo da Vinci, this portrait, one of the early portraits he does.
yeah, another really intimate, beautiful portrait. Yeah, but you can see the correlation between what he sees as he's trying to sort of draw a storm, isn't he?
Yes, yes. It's almost like that kind of curl becomes his signature in a way.
Yeah,
And then, I absolutely love this one. Leonardo was obsessed with four-legged animals. I mean, he studies them. He was able to also see real lions in Florence because they kept them in the behind Palazzo Vecchio. There's a Via dei Leoni, the Street of Lions, because actually this is where they would usually keep a male and a female lion. And
What, just in a cage and sort of for the public to walk by and look at?
they
Or
would be, in a way, they would even like be able to foresee the future of Florence at the time. For example, if they had a little cub, like a little baby lion, it was a good sign, like a good omen for the city of Florence. If one of them died, it was also a kind of a bad sign.
oh
And there are
wow.
lions everywhere. Next time when you're in Florence, or your viewers, if they come to Palazzo Vecchio, just look around to see how many lions there actually are in that square in the Piazza della Signoria. There are hundreds of them.
Wow.
But look, Nick, I love the drawing of all kind of animals and just little baby dragon, like right here in the
Oh
middle.
yeah. Baby dragon, I could see cats, I could see sort of ermines, I could see lions, I could see
Yes.
all kinds of different animals.
Look at this one. I mean, just it's just absolutely, look how live these are. Leonardo is amazing in the way how he can actually, show give them so much character and just kind of, putting this kind of mythological figure among other things as well.
But he's gone from, trying to understand the science of water to just and one afternoon just drawing, a load of different animals and some even in his imagination, like the lion. So he's really got a very active mind that's sort of jumping around everywhere, isn't it? You can see that clearly from his sketchbooks.
Yes, yes. And I think, that is what makes him fascinating, the fact that his curiosity was never ending. And we will see that as we go. I love this study for the Madonna and the Child. And then you see, Nick, you have little kids, and how quickly can they torture a cat? And I just love how, this way he's just looking at the child. Poor cat. I mean, look here. It's like,
Oh yeah, sort of
it's
torturing.
given up.
The picture of a child sort of torturing, trying to play with a cat, but a bit too much, and the cat
Yes,
doesn't seem too happy about it. That's
yes,
hilarious, isn't it? And almost
yes.
looks like there's sort of cat footprints on top as well. He
That's
seemed to
true.
he seems to be a cat lover,
He
Leonardo.
yes, I think he just loved everything around him, all the animals. I mean, he just loved nature. He loved the world around him. Um, but what I wanted to also point out, is this love, of course, of the flight of birds.
Yeah, often when passing the places where birds were sold, he would take them with his own hand out of their cages, and having paid to those who sold them the price that was asked, he let them fly away into the air, restoring them to their lost liberty. Wow.
And I love this page that is in the Palazzo Reale in Turin, because you really see Leonardo very carefully trying to figure out how are these birds actually staying in the air, trying to understand the mechanism of their flight, and then putting notes. And I know there was many attempts for Leonardo to fly, where he would actually make wings for him and his assistants and try to jump. We don't know how those ended for some of these people who were around him, but he was definitely obsessed with the flight of birds.
Well, yeah, he was trying to understand how birds flew, and maybe he could invent, a flying machine kind of thing.
Yes, which was one big thing. And then another interest he has, of course, is this kind of insatiable interest in human beings, and how we get old. Like, look at the one on the left. We have an old man and a young man. Some people believe it's basically the same person. So as we age, this beautiful profile with beautiful curly hair, then it becomes a man who's lost all of his hair, who obviously lost his teeth as well. And then he's losing, height, losing some inches as well.
They don't look like they're drawn from life, though. They look like they're drawn from his imagination.
Yes, it's like kind of like this idea of, what happens to us as we age.
Yeah, yeah. So the
Um,
young boy on the right and the old man on the left looking at each other. It's like, yeah, youth and old age.
yes, really cool transformation. Then, just look here, he's looking at all kind of characters. And, Leonardo used to say that we should always have a block of paper and a pen in our pocket to record things we think and also to, sketch people we see around us. So obviously this was kind of one good example of that.
Incredible, just incredible draftsman. I mean, this drawing here is just absolutely stunning of the top one of the man there. He's just just a very talented artist. Even though he probably didn't consider it that important, you can see from these sketches he's just so naturally talented and gifted.
Yes, yes. And I actually wanted to kind of introduce the topic, of for us today, the anatomical studies, and how that then leads to a Vitruvian man. And I wanted to start with this page because I think it really kind of sums up what Leonardo is able to do. And it's an écorché,
Yeah,
a figure drawn and painted. You probably had to do this in
yeah,
school as well. Um,
yeah.
and Leonardo doesn't really invent this. I mean, he will take it to a whole new level, but it's actually Leo Battista Alberti who gives this advice.
Before dressing a man, we first draw him nude, then we unfold him in draperies. In painting the nude, we place first his bones and muscles, which we then cover with flesh, so that it is not difficult to understand where each muscle is beneath. Yeah, that's an écorché. Yeah,
Isn't it just so interesting? So you kind of see this mix of painting and drawing, but
yeah.
what I wanted to do, Nick, I actually wanted us
I mean,
to,
I think these are some of the finest drawings in the world. He's probably one of the greatest draw draftsmen that's ever existed.
yes, yes. And I just wanted to, to understand how his anatomical studies are so special. I wanted to kind of go back a little bit. Well, in this case, a lot. And to kind of see, okay, how did people study anatomy? Where did it all start? It actually starts with Galenus, the man who was born in a Roman, kind of Greek Roman colony. He was a physician, a surgeon, and philosopher. He died in 3rd century AD. And Galenus is interesting because he was actually the one who did maybe some of the first dissections. We know that he would actually use dead bodies of gladiators to look at human anatomy. And
Wow.
he was a personal physician to several Roman emperors. And what is interesting to me is that his views of anatomy kind of remained unchallenged for 1200 years.
That's just incredible. You think about the amount of progress we've made in the last 100 years. To think 1,200 years, that there was that little progress.
Yes, to think, that this is going to be the time of course, the dark ages are going to happen in the meantime. But I think it's just fascinating. So, we have someone like that. But Galenus is interesting because he actually compared doctors to architects. And I love that because Alberti and Leonardo actually both compared the construction of walls to that of bones in human body. So kind of
Yeah.
this idea of doctors and architects already kind of starts in the Roman times. And then probably you never heard of this guy, Mondino de Luzzi. Mondino was a really interesting person who was actually living in Bologna. And he performed his first public dissections in January of 1315 in the presence of medical students and many other spectators. Probably it was a woman, probably an executed female kind of criminal. That was the body that they used. And he was the first to actually incorporate the study of anatomy in the medical curriculum. And this is important to us, because when Leonardo is studying anatomy in Florence, he's doing it from this artistic point of view. He's learning his craft. But then he comes to Milan and he realizes, wow, people actually do this here because they're studying medicine. And Mondino is interesting because he actually will publish his own lessons in anatomy. And you see the cover page of this book. It's actually in the exhibition in the Academia. They have one of the copies of this publication. Believe it or not, they published it 40 times. It actually had 40 different editions when it was first printed, after it was first printed. And what do you
He was very famous doctor.
So he was, and he also, is able to actually do these public dissections. So what we see on the cover is interesting. You actually see kind of how they would be done. So the Mondino would be seated like a professor, on the cathedra. And he's obviously has his book and he's kind of, telling students what's going on. And then he has an assistant who is actually doing dissection of the
Oh
body
yeah.
and showing
Wow.
off what they do. So this is kind of how dissections would be done. And just imagine,
He'll
100
let he lets
students.
his assistant do the grotty work of cutting the body
Exactly.
open. Yeah.
Exactly.
Nice of him. Not getting his
Uh,
hands dirty.
yeah, exactly, but anyway, what was problem with his manual is he kind of sometimes copies Galenus a lot, so he's sometimes wrong. But it was mostly text, not visuals. So
Right.
it's just kind of like a boring anatomical
So do
text
you think
to
that
read.
Leonardo da Vinci would have actually dissected a body?
He did. He
Wow.
did 30. We know that he actually did it 30 times, and we will actually get to it now. I just wanted to show
So
you,
for
look,
a
this is,
vegetarian that doesn't like to see animals get hurt or anything like that, yeah, he didn't mind cutting open a human body. That's quite a step, isn't it?
Nick, I love that as you ask this question, we will actually get to see Leonardo answer all these questions as we go. But I wanted to look this is how Mondino's anatomia looked like. And then compare that to what Leonardo does. Oh, sorry. I will show you Leonardo's in a second, but just this is another man that we should really get to know. His name was Marcantonio della Torre, and he was a professor of anatomy in Padua and Pavia. And actually, he was Leonardo's friend. This is one of the first of series of friends I wanted to introduce because this brilliant young man starts working with Leonardo, and in a way, he's challenging or channeling Leonardo's curiosity because his goal was to actually publish this treatise on anatomy together. But if you look at the dates of his life, you see that he dies very young.
Yeah.
He actually dies of plague at the age of 30, which basically stopped this dream of publication to become a reality.
Right.
But it is Della Torre who will kind of take young Leonardo under his wing and, teach him things he needed to do. And this is what Leonardo is able to do. So I want to just go back for a second. This is kind of what we have, in history. And then look what Leonardo is able to do.
Yeah, it's like a totally different thing. It's like looking at 3D animation almost. It's beautifully drawn, beautifully rendered, and it really gives you the idea of a physical object, doesn't it?
Yes. The initial studies that Leonardo does were actually basically based on the skulls. This is in 1480s, like 1489. And he's in Milan. And obviously, you see that he's basically looking at the skull that was sawn in half. So you see kind
Yeah.
of one half of it on the right side. On the left, you see a skull that was kind of sewn sideways. So you see more of like sinuses and just, kind of the inner part of the skull. But then he kind of goes in and look, he even is able to, blow a part of it. And then he shows us the human teeth.
Oh
And
wow.
and then he
And
even
and
writes,
he numbers them, how many there are.
he does. And then he also says, like, the humans usually have 32. And then he kind of, you see even like the roots are perfectly rendered. So literally, this is like, pioneering the inventive streak.
Where's he getting the money to do this? Um, and why is he doing this? I mean, it is fascinating, but for what reason is he doing it? I mean, is the Duke of Milan asking him to investigate this? Is he just got him on a retainer, just paying him to be this curious person? Like, how's it actually working in the physical, reality?
Yes. Great question, Nick. I think this is all his own personal curiosity. I think he wanted to understand how we are designed. I think, it initially starts as an artist trying to perfect his skill as an artist, but then it goes into this deep obsession. Probably with Della Torre, they're working together to be able to, create something really beautiful, to have this first, anatomical treatise printed So he has an expert who is probably, directing him what to do. And that will, unfortunately not go forever because of Tornatore's very short life. But I think what we get to see here is just Leonardo's genius to be able to show us and give us so much information. This is literally how we do things now, right? We do kind of like a 3D sketch. You then put in the words to describe. And there's a really nice example here. Look, if we are to just cover, one part of it, look how little now we get from this drawing.
Yeah, true.
So Leonardo really has this incredible skill to be able to show something, something in a very different, very new way. It goes on, and I have to tell you this story. I absolutely love this. So when Leonardo comes back to Florence from Milan, he will, stay in the city for a bit. So in Milan and in Florence, he's able to dissect the bodies. But in Rome, he actually gets in trouble with the Pope. So it's interesting, it's a very, Catholic state. The church is so important. And, if you are dissecting bodies, you're kind of dealing with sorcery, and it would not be a positive image. So depending on kind of where he is, there's a little bit more kind of liberty, I guess, for him to be able to do this. But in case of this man, he actually meets this old man in Florence. And Leonardo will hang out in Santa Maria Nuova. The church still exists today. And he would actually go and kind of try to sit with people who are there, because I think he tried to understand the kind of the mystery of that, and how do we pass on, so he meets this
Wow. So wait,
man.
so he went to the hospital to meet with dying people?
Yes, I think he was meeting everyone. I think he was such a curious guy. He probably just wanted to meet people who were, for some reason interesting to him. But in this case, he meets the old man who tells him that he lived to be more than 100 and he was always very healthy.
So that's a drawing of this old man on his sort of
Yes,
deathbed. Wow.
yes, probably when he died, Leonardo, does this drawing of him, and then he will proceed on to dissect his body over 30 pages.
Incredible.
And you just look at the way how,
He must have got the permission of the man before he died. Surely.
yeah, you kind of wonder, if it's,
Yeah.
I don't know if it had to be the permission from the man himself, or maybe the prior of the hospital, or if no one claimed the body to bury, I think there must probably some, extraordinary cases, because I think in Milan it's mostly executed criminals.
Right. I'm
But I
getting
think,
the idea that he was much more interested in this kind of scientific work than he was in fine art and painting. Although he did produce some beautiful paintings, he didn't put much energy into it during his life, did he? He put huge amounts of energy into the investigation of the natural world and the biological world and just pretty much everything.
yep. And I mean, it seems almost like, this was his curiosity, the endless curiosity, right? I have some of his own writings. I love this, okay? In this case, he's basically telling you, if you wanted to start doing dissections, what could go wrong and what you should keep in mind.
You will perhaps be deterred by your stomach, and if this does not deter you, you may be deterred by the fear of living through the night hours in the company of quartered and flayed corpses, fearful to behold. And if this does not deter you, perhaps you will lack the good draftsmanship that such a depiction requires. And even if you have skill in drawing, it may not be accompanied by a knowledge of perspective. And if it were so accompanied, you may lack the methods of geometrical demonstration and of calculating the forces and strengths of the muscles, or perhaps you will lack patience so that you will not be diligent. That's quite a negative sort of thing to say. It's I don't quite understand why he's writing that. Is he saying that you don't have the stomach that I have and the skill at draftsmanship that I have and the skill at perspective that I have, it seems like he sort of is saying that.
Yes, I think it's a lot to unpack. I think he's, really, I think, but he honestly lists everything that there is. I mean, as I was, working on this, just the pages I was able to see, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm so used to talking about beautiful things, the privilege of looking at beautiful Renaissance art. And after a while, I was getting tired, of these, parts of the bodies and dissections. Some are really disturbing, like look at this one, for example, where he's actually looking at the unborn baby. And this is probably the first time when someone is able to show the fetus in a correct position. Probably this poor woman died in childbirth, and he is able to actually do this, dissection and just look at the details and what he's able to kind of go into.
I mean, it's really beautifully drawn, but if you actually think of the reality of what he was doing back then, yes, this woman probably died in birth, and a couple of hours later, they probably cut her open, and he's literally drawing her insides. It's quite graphic, isn't it, when you think about it like that? But these drawings are stunning, and like you say, it's probably the first drawing of a baby in the womb in the world ever, and first observed.
Yes. And just imagine, you see how much he's putting in. I think sometimes he's wrong, like here, maybe the lining of the uterus. This is, I think, wrong. Sometimes he's also mixing up kind of like the animal world with the human. I think he's like filling in the gaps. Oh, yes. He probably dissected about 30 human corpses, but like probably countless animals as well.
Yeah,
And look, Nick, I mean, look at the conditions would be just brutal.
yeah,
He has
absolutely.
like, knives and few things and just, the body is decaying very quickly, in these, it's a really
They
interesting.
probably didn't know much about, clean hands and things like that, or disease or anything like that. It would have been very much the early days of dissection and this kind of the study of inside humans. They didn't know much about it back then.
Yes. And, I think I also have a quote by Leonardo himself, because you kind of wonder, how does he reconcile with that? Like how does he justify what he's doing?
You should not be distressed that your discoveries come through another's death. Rather, you should rejoice that our Creator has provided an instrument of such excellence. Yeah, he was clearly fascinated by how we were made and how humans were made. He was just fascinated in human beings, wasn't he?
Yes, yes. And another fascination that Leonardo has is going to be, architecture. And he spends years also doing these architectural projects.
Did he design any buildings that were made?
There some believe that one of the churches in Todi might be kind of based on his design,
Okay.
but nothing really kind of given to his name. He's working with architects in Milan who are, doing some stuff for the Duomo of Milan at the time. So he's able to kind of meet important people in the field. And this is where kind of I want to go into kind of a new direction a bit to kind of reconcile these two things, his love of human anatomy, but also love of architecture and these really precise measurements, because he will unite both of them in the work of when he's trying to kind of depict this idea of what Vitruvius, this Roman architect, writes.
In a temple, there ought to be harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts to the whole. In the human body, the central point is the navel. If a man is placed flat on his back, with his hands and feet extended, and a compass centered at his navel, his fingers and toes will touch the circumference of a circle thereby described. And just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square may be found from it. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, and then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of a perfect square. So this was not by Da Vinci, but by Vitruvius, who was who? He was what years did he live?
So Vitruvius, I think he's actually first century AD.
Right, so Roman.
So Roman architect.
He's a Roman
And
architect. So clearly Leonardo da Vinci has read this and knows this, because he's sort of Vitruvian man is exactly what he's drawn. I mean, from this writing.
and you know what? Not only that, but it will be something that will be very important, because when the Vitruvian, when his books on architecture were found, I think they were found in this monastery in Switzerland. They were completely lost, right? The Roman world is completely lost to the humanists, let's say, who are studying this in the 15th century. And this incredible discovery is found because Vitruvius, actually, in his books on architecture, he doesn't go around telling you what to do and how to build, which is something that basically will be done like, Leon Battista Alberti will do that with his books on architecture. The Vitruvius will actually talk about the buildings he sees. So he travels around the Roman Empire and he goes, hey, on to the right, you see this, and he he's able to describe to you how Roman cities looked like. And then he kind of goes into this, that the human body can fit in a square and a circle. And the statement he's making here is not just mathematical, it's actually metaphysical. Because in the ancient world, the circle and square were really important. The circle would have been the infinite and divine, and the square would be our realm, like a earthly realm. So the fact that human body can fit into both is like making humans to be human and divine. And we only have a text by this, but then we will see how Leonardo will be just one of many men who will try to put these words into a visual, into an image for us.
Wow.
Okay.
So these were famous words. They were known throughout sort of Renaissance Europe, or
Yes. Well, I think, people who are studying, the humanist texts, they would be obsessed with what Vitruvius,
right.
has to offer.
Yeah.
And this is what Leonardo comes up with.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably his most famous drawing, isn't it? The Vitruvian Man.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
can you tell us more about it?
I have to say, I just got to see it in Venice for the first time ever, like 4 days ago. And he is so alive. He's almost ready to actually jump off the page. And I was not expecting that. I was not expecting to kind of see almost like a reality. And you take a look, as an artist, you can see how he's, first of all, fitting the body in a circle and a square.
He's drawn exactly what we just read by Vitruvius, the Roman architect.
Yes.
He's obviously read that and been very inspired by it, and then thought to himself, well, let me actually execute it and show the world, or to show myself what exactly that looks like, because it's precisely what we've just read.
Yes, and note this, the problem is, how do you align the circle and the square? So if you look, you see on the bottom, that square is touching and the circle they're touching, right? So the man is kind of standing on the bottom, but if you look up, you actually see that the circle goes all well above it.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is something that, Vitruvius didn't really specify in a way. So you kind of have to do like experimenting, like, okay, here's the circle, right, going to the navel. And I wanted to show you just, few other people who are doing this, because Leonardo is not the only one. I love, this quote.
By the ancients, man was termed a lesser world, and certainly the use of this name is well bestowed, because his body is an analog for the world.
So yeah, so we have this idea of microcosm, right? That we are the world in a miniature.
Yeah,
You're not only governed by the rules,
kind of thing.
Yes, yes. So they kind of designed and the principles that are that govern the world, and we are the world itself. So Leonardo knows that. I mean, he writes that very early, in his life. But let me show you what other people do. For example, a man that Leonardo would have known really well was this Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who was actually really a architect coming from Siena. And he goes to Milan to work on the cathedral in Milan. I wanted to do this very quickly because just look at his pages. Very similar to what Leonardo is doing. But you see kind of a different spirit behind it, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, slightly less fluent, but still good drawings. But yeah, a little bit less fluent and a little bit less freehand.
Yes, I mean this. You can kind of see an organized mind. This guy is a guy who respects his deadlines. He actually accomplished quite a lot. He published his own book, on technical drawings and stuff. So this is his attempt into the Vitruvian Man.
Wow, that's a really interesting comparison, isn't it? Because it just looks so primitive
Yes,
compared
yes.
to the life that so lifelike the Vitruvian Man that Leonardo drew, and this one just seems like a strange thing to look at. It's not very interesting to look at, not very nice to look at.
And exactly, because Vitruvius doesn't really tell us about the beauty or a figure being alive. He just really, you can do this easily just by putting like a stick figure in a way, and I think we see that in Martini's document. We know that Leonardo owned a copy of the treatise on architecture that this man published. So Leonardo knew him and his work. And I love this. This is his attempt on the Vitruvian Man.
I quite like that one, but yeah, it's nowhere near as good as
Yes.
it's nowhere near as good, and it's sort of not accurate at all, is it?
And then look at also the way, that actually the circle and the square overlap. And this is something that, keep in mind this, because I think he's figuring, it's like, looks like this really poetic, shy, Vitruvian man.
Yeah.
But
Quite a sweet drawing though.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
And then, another person that is very important to us is this one, Giacomo Andrea, coming from Ferrara.
Yeah.
And, he was an architect and the author on commentary on Vitruvius. We know very little about Giacomo. And believe it or not, this drawing was actually only discovered like in 1980s.
Oh wow.
So it was completely unknown. And do you see the similarity between this and Leonardo's work?
Yeah, a little bit, but I mean, they're just none of these drawings compare to Leonardo's work at all. They're just his work is such on another level.
Yes, yes. But I think what I love about this is maybe from him, because Leonardo actually was a very good friend. Someone describes them like, that Giacomo Andrea was like a brother to Leonardo. They probably were talking about this and figuring it out, because you see how Leonardo will actually use this setup where the circle is a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So he probably uses what Giacomo Andrea figured out already. And then, he'll take it to a whole new level. But sadly, another friend that Leonardo will lose, when the French come to Milan, Giacomo Andrea is actually put on trial. He's beheaded, and his body is split into 4 parts and hanged on different parts of the, different entrances to the city of Milan.
My God, what did he do?
Just because he was, a supporter of the Sforza family. When the French arrived, I think there was like some maybe conspiracy against the French or something like that, and he couldn't have been, he couldn't have been saved. So, the fact
Bloodthirsty
that
times, but Leonardo wasn't there at the time.
I think Leonardo comes back to Florence, and he actually will end up actually going to live and work in France, with kind of the enemies of.
That's where he ended his. Well, that's where he died, wasn't it? He lived his last years in France.
Yes, yes. But I just think I love the idea of these men, discussing Vitruvius, talking about this, probably Giacomo Andrea, figuring it out with Leonardo as well. And then, come back to Leonardo and you just see here the intensity of the gaze.
Yeah,
Uh,
almost looks like a self-portrait.
yep. And, this is something that you see in the great book on Leonardo by Walter Isaacson.
Yeah,
He actually, writes about this, and how this could possibly be a self-portrait. And I have to say, I do believe it now that I've seen it, in person. The intensity of the gaze is incredible, almost like a person looking at the mirror, looking at themselves. And if you can think of Leonardo's description, he had this like a curly hair arriving to his shoulders. And he had this really like he was a very handsome man. So you kind of see that perfection here because this drawing is almost like too beautiful. His point is already made. Why make it so alive?
yeah, incredible. But these notebooks were really just for his own personal use, weren't they? I mean, it's amazing to think that he wouldn't have had any perception that the world would have seen, this drawing's become so famous.
True. And what's interesting to me is we know the provenance of this drawing. We will talk about it a little bit later at the end, what happens to these drawings and how they ended up really being scattered around the world. But this one actually, is found in Venice basically at the end of the 1800s. Nick, when I saw this in a museum, I think what was really fascinating is just, how alive these hands are. The fingers are kind of almost like moving. You almost see this man kind of, working out, how the hands will be going up and down like wings. And then look at the feet. You can really kind of see someone carefully looking at their own foot and kind of turning it, with perspective. Of course, this one is kind of funny, but because he's using this as a foot of a measurement,
Yeah.
you know. And then just quickly to kind of show you on the top and the bottom the text that goes with this.
If you open your legs enough that your head is lowered by 1/14 of your height, and raise your hands enough that your extended fingers touch the line of the top of your head, know that the center of the extended limbs will be the navel, and the space between legs will be an equilateral triangle.
So, he's definitely, going with Vitruvius. And here on the bottom, he kind of goes in and like he's measuring, you don't have to read this, like he's measuring the human body in every possible way. Like, from the elbow to the tip of the hand will be the fifth part of a man.
You can see that in the drawing too. He's sort of measuring every bit, like the forearm to the upper arm to the chest to the shoulder. Every bit of the Vitruvian man seems to be measured.
Yes. And what I love, and I left it here in bold, the foot is in the seventh part of the man. I left this in the bold because what Leonardo does, he's looking and reading Vitruvius, but when he is down to the measurements, he does his own. Like, the Vitruvius said that, the foot is the sixth part of the man. Leonardo changes that. So he kind of, even though he's reading something, he actually goes with his own, empirical research, and he's
Yeah,
recording that.
which is very scientific and very modern thinking. It's the way the modern mind works more than a man that lived 600 years ago.
Yes, exactly. So I think I just love that. And then, here's a lovely detail, of him measuring this very carefully. And these is he a self-portrait or not? I mean, Leonardo, even oh look this. I even have a better picture now that I've seen it in a museum. But you really see the focused eyes, the focused gaze. Look at the lips, very interesting the way they are done. A good-looking man, that's for sure.
And
And
very lifelike too. You can imagine that was drawn from life.
yes, Yes, the presence that it has, it's actually spectacular. Toby Lester is the one who wrote a book about this drawing, and he actually says, kind of thinking if this is a portrait. Even Leonardo says that every man paints himself, that you can't really help it. I don't know, Nick, you're an artist. I mean, do you paint yourself always or parts
Well,
of
they say that
yourself?
about Rembrandt, that a painting by Rembrandt is more a painting of himself than it is of the actual sitter. But yeah, I can understand that idea.
Yes. So anyway, Toby Lester actually wrote, he said, it's an idealized self-portrait in which Leonardo, stripped down to his essence, takes his own measure, and in doing so embodies a timeless human hope that we just might have the power of mind to figure out how we fit into the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, fantastic.
Think of the picture as an act of speculation, a kind of metaphysical self-portrait in which Leonardo, as an artist, a natural philosopher, and a stand-in for all humanity, peers at himself with furrowed brow and tries to grasp the secrets of his own nature. The question if this was self-portrait or not, I wanted to kind of go into this for a moment and just to show you, what do we have of Leonardo in the city? Some people believe that Leonardo served as a portrait to Verrocchio's own version of David, which is in the Bargello Museum. And,
Incredible.
you see again, the handsome young man with the curls, coming down to his shoulder. And then they also believe that Verrocchio used Michelangelo as a model for the Doubting Thomas on Or San Michele.
Incredible.
Of course, we will never know this, but if you just take a look at the two, you kind of really do see resemblance.
Yeah, that's true. You do see a very striking resemblance.
Where do you see it the most, Nick?
Well, the lips, the nose, and the eyes, and the strong forehead.
Yes, and I also love, how his eyebrows are actually not curved line, but they're actually more of a flat, straight line, which you
Yeah,
also see here.
yeah.
So easily
And
this could
also the
be,
cheeks. You can see the cheeks are sort of, they're quite defined, like they are in the Vitruvian Man drawing.
yes, yes. So, I love, this young man who then becomes a very handsome, older guy, and there he is.
Yeah,
The same hairstyle as well. It's just a speculation, of course, but I don't know if anyone ever has actually compared, none that I know of, comparing Verrocchio's works with the Vitruvian Man. But I think after you see the drawing, and I hope you will get to see it when the exhibition is in Academia until the end of July this year, 2025. And I think if you see it in person, it really does kind of bring this person alive. Um, and then Carlo Pedretti, who was considered to be one of the most important Leonardo scholars ever. He was in Florence. Pedretti always said that, he kind of saw that young man with curly hair also in the angel in Leonardo's early work in the Uffizi Gallery. So I think that's also quite interesting. It kind of always revolves around a figure that kind of has this beautiful, curly hair.
yeah. One of his signature designs that he has in a lot of his drawings and a lot of his paintings is this curly hair that he loved to paint.
Yeah. Yes, yes. So, Nick, the last part that I just wanted to share would be, what happens to Leonardo's drawings, and what happens to all this patrimony. So when he died in France in 1519, he left everything to his pupil Francesco Melzi.
And you're saying there was about 7,000 pages or 7,000?
Yes.
7,000 pages. I'm trying to think how many So in a notebook, you probably 50 pages in a notebook. So yeah, I mean, we're talking. Let's say there's 100 pages in a notebook, so we're talking about 700, sort of sketchbook notebooks that he's.
And and they're kind of loose. They're loose pages. So
Oh, so they weren't in books. They weren't bound in books.
they were not. So like codex would be kind of like we call them codex now, but they would be kind of like an early older version of a book would be like codex would be just pages bound on one side.
It's a hell of a
But
lot. Basically, what I'm trying to say is it's a hell of a lot of work.
it is. It is. And
It's a
I think
library full of stuff.
Isaacson in his book, when he writes about this, he says, what's the best way to, store material? Well, paper. I mean, how many emails do you have from 2008? Not so many, right? But Vasari actually writes about this, and he could have met Melzi in Milan. He kind of writes how he held this, in his home.
He holds them dear and keeps such papers together as if they were relics in company with the portraits of Leonardo of happy memory. So he has some portraits as well of Leonardo's.
Yes, so he had everything there. And then when he died, everything was left to Melzi's son Orazio, who didn't really seem to care a lot about this stuff. And everything basically ends up being given or sold to Pompeo Leoni. And he was actually the son of Leone Leoni, a sculptor who was active in Rome and who was a friend of Michelangelo.
So wait, so they go from France to Milan,
Yes.
and then they travel to Rome. All of these things.
They're given to Pompeo Leoni, and then look what happens with Leoni. He gets them. This is Del Greco's portrait of Pompeo. And Leoni basically, dismantles the original manuscripts, and he creates two separate collections.
Right. So what does he do with the two separate collections?
I think he kind of organizes them, based on the subject.
So one stays in Rome?
So, no. Actually, you know what? Pompeo Leoni he ends his life in Spain. So he kind of traveled with these drawings. And I will just show you kind of where they end up. One of them is in Biblioteca Ambrosiana. This Codex Atlanticus. It's called Atlanticus because it looks like a big atlas, the way it's kind of bind together. So that is one. Another part of it is in Madrid. And, I love that all of these are very much available to us. Like if you wanted to go on the website, you can literally click on each page and kind of go through them to see. But then how some of them end up in England is thanks to this 14th Earl of Arundel, who was actually, he was really crazy. Look at the portrait of Rubens. I think he had like more than 60 portraits of himself done, Nick.
Wow.
I think like 2 by Rubens or something like that. And I think he's
my kind of guy.
Yes, exactly. He'll be ideal patron for you. He's actually traveling in Italy on this grand tour, and he buys some of these things from Leoni. And some of them end up in the collection of Charles II. This is now, the ones that are basically at Windsor. And I think there's like 550 of them or something like that in the Royal Collection. And they're really beautiful.
And is that the majority of the drawings together? Is the Royal Collection's drawings, or where are the most? Who holds the most drawings of Leonardo's?
Well, I have more examples here. I think the Royal Collection has about 500, and maybe more than 500 out of that, 7,200.
Does anyone have more?
I think so. But as far as the numbers go, I'm not perfectly, clear. But look at this one. The first Earl of Leicester is the one who has this other codex that then ends up going to the US with Armand Hammer. And that is one Bill Gates purchased at the auction in 1994.
Do we know what happened to them?
They're still in Gates' collection. He has them kind of traveling the world. So every year, another city will show them. I actually got to see them in the Uffizi Gallery.
How many does Bill Gates own?
I don't know. I mean, that it's now called the Codex Leicester because of the first Earl who owned it.
Yeah.
And at the time when he buys them, it was the most expensive price, paid for book of drawings. But it
Seems
was
like
now,
seems like nothing now.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So the Bill Gates is the one who kind of public can see and actually saw them in Florence. So with this, I just wanted to kind of end with this idea. If Leonardo's studies were published, he would definitely have this wonderful title of being the first man who kind of did the complete anatomical studies. But he doesn't get to do it because of his own perfectionism, because of the fact that he couldn't reconcile, his own findings with what was written in the sources at the time, and also the fact that he loses dear friends, very young. De La Torre dies at 30. His friend Andrea is also, beheaded in a horrible way, ends his life. And because of this, they kind of end up just being, lost and given to this Melzi, who probably was just overwhelmed what to do with this incredible patrimony that, Leonardo left for him. And, if you think about this, Nick, we only get to appreciate these maybe now in the last century because as far as I was able to find, in all of these collections that they were in, they were kind of lost in England, in Madrid. I think they were in these collections, but kind of tucked in some, dusty shelves. And then only later they're kind of like, they come to the surface, like late in maybe like 19th century. And then, which now our way to digitalize everything is really kind of where they can, be kind of spread around the world and people can look at them digitally and see them.
Yeah, well, I've always been absolutely fascinated by Leonardo da Vinci's drawings since I was very young. In fact, I own several books about his drawings. They are just some of the most beautiful works of art ever produced. And the most incredible thing is they weren't really meant for public consumption. They were just private studies for his own curious mind to kind of understand the world better and on a deeper level. And so I think that intimacy really is incredible. But of course, that's not what's happened to them now. Bill Gates buying them, and they're displayed in museums, and it's amazing what happens, through time to these incredible works of art. But at least we can appreciate them, and I really appreciate you today, Paola. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for explaining at such a great level of understanding Leonardo da Vinci's drawings, his sketchbooks, how his mind worked. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I really, really appreciate your time.
It was such a pleasure to be here and keep up the good work.
Ciao. Speak soon. Bye.
Ciao.